Well, good Monday afternoon, and welcome to another live crowdcast interactive conversation at Richland Source. We are located inside the podcast room at IdeaWorks in downtown Mansfield. My name is Carl Hunnell. I'm the city editor for Source Media, which includes Richland Source, Ashland Source, and Knox Pages. We are happy you've joined us today for a conversation about the history of presidential elections in the United States. Now, certainly 2020 has provided us with one of the most interesting, divisive, and critical presidential election years in our nation's history. It's a campaign set against the backdrop of one of the worst pandemics of a century and racial unrest that we've seen across the country. But how different is this campaign? Is this truly unprecedented presidential politics? Have we seen some of this stuff before? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Some housekeeping first. If you have questions or comments as we go, please feel free to post them in the chat. Our Brittany Schock with Richland Source is with us today, and you'll see her chatting with you as well. Be sure to vote in our polls. Other than that, just sit back, enjoy your lunch, and take a look back into U.S. presidential politics. And we are joined today by Dr. John Moser, chair of the Master of American History and Government at Ashland University. He's the good-looking guy in the picture, where he has taught since 2001. John earned his undergraduate degree at Ohio University, go Bobcats, and his master's and PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. John taught at George Mason University and the University of Georgia, go Bulldogs, before coming to Ashland. John has written several books about history, has also created some wonderful historical role-playing games that are being used in classrooms across the country. So welcome, John. How are you today, sir?
I'm fantastic, Carl. It's great to be with you.
And you're back in the classroom this year, so talk a little bit about what that's been like.
Well, it's wonderful to be back. I was actually on a study leave last year, and it was a very good year to be on a study leave. But I was missing the classroom anyway, and it's weird. Of course, I've got strict limits to the number of students in most of the rooms, but it's great to be to have real live students.
Very good. All right, so we got a lot of stuff to cover, so let's just dive right in. Now, I did some limited amount of research and preparation. Needless to say, it made me long for the days of the first presidential selection when George Washington was the unanimous choice in 1788, got 100% of the electoral vote. That must have been a calm situation, but those days are long gone, so let's dive in. Let's go back more than 200 years. Two of our founding fathers are vying for the White House in 1800. I saw somewhere they called it the Revolution of 1800. John, what can you tell us about the presidential race of 1800?
Well, it was the first time there was a real a peaceful transition of power, because it's easy for us to look back to 1800 and say, well, of course, the election would happen and an incumbent president would make way for the newly elected one. But nobody could have predicted what would actually happen. That Adams was an incumbent. It was a fiercely partisan campaign. Anybody who thinks today's politics are contentious, and they are. I'm not saying for a minute that they aren't. But certainly the anger and the rancor that have characterized the 2020 campaign is not unprecedented. It was easily matched by the kind of things you heard on both sides in 1800. Although a lot of it was not directly connected to either. I mean, neither candidate abused the other directly. They clearly didn't like each other, although they made nice later on in their careers. But it was always surrogates who went after each other. In 1800. It still was not, campaigning for office was not something that was done, and it was, this was something that gentlemen got involved with. Their surrogates, of course, would fight tooth and nail and would campaign very hard, but the candidates themselves tried to stay above the fight. But what's interesting about 1800, a couple of things we're saying about it. Is as I said, you had an incumbent of the Federalist Party who loses and steps aside, and the government peacefully transfers from the rule of the Federalist Party to the rule of the Democratic Republican Party. The other interesting thing involves the Electoral College. And I want to say a little bit about the Electoral College because it's very much an issue today, right? Is it something outmoded that we should do away with? And a couple of things that you hear, that sometimes you hear from conservatives, that the reason the Electoral College was added was to keep the big states from drowning out the small states in terms of elections. And that may have had something to do with how it was organized, but it was not the actual reason. And then sometimes you hear from people on the left, the Electoral College was created to protect slavery. Also not the case. The real reason it was created was the founders at the Constitutional Convention did not imagine that ordinary people would be able to pick a president. Why? Because they didn't have a continental understanding of things. Like, they would pay attention to politics, but the politics that would mean most to them would be state or local. So they might be familiar with people in their own community or in their own state, but there's not, after George Washington, of course. George Washington was the big exception. Everybody obviously knew who Washington was. But the concern was, once Washington is gone, who else is there who is well known enough? So the expectation was people would just go, if people just voted for whoever they wanted, they could. Nobody would ever get a majority because they would just vote for the local popular politician that they liked. So instead, we're going to have these electors who get chosen. The electors are going to get together, and those are going to be presumably men of more of broader understanding of political affairs, and then they could decide. And of course, it's often forgotten that if they couldn't, if there was no majority candidate among the Electoral College, that it would get thrown to the House of Representatives. In fact, the founders believed that in most cases, the House of Representatives would end up picking the president. And so arguably, the Electoral College, after maybe 1796, it didn't really operate the way it was anticipated it would, mainly because the founders did not anticipate the rise of parties. And because party apparatus or apparati started to develop on both sides, there were ways to advertise the candidate all over the country. So you could be a Federal, no matter where you lived, you could be a Federalist, and you knew that John Adams was your candidate in 1800. If you were a Democratic Republican, didn't matter if you were in South Carolina or New York, you knew that Thomas Jefferson was going to be your candidate. But one other really weird thing about 1800 was the original Constitution said that the vice presidency goes to whoever got the second highest number of electoral votes. And in fact, there was a tie in the Electoral College, and the tie did not involve Adams. Adams was out. Anybody who has seen the musical Hamilton might know something about this story. There was a tie in the Electoral College between two Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and then it got thrown to the House of Representatives. Federalists were kind of up in the air, right? Because our guy's already out, so who do we vote for? And there was a lot of wrangling. Some thought, well, Aaron Burr, because Thomas Jefferson is too outspoken, he's too pro-French, etc. But it ends up being it ends up going for Jefferson, largely due to the fact that Hamilton, who just he clashed with Jefferson on so many things, and like 700 different fronts or so. There's a line from the musical. Hamilton says that Jefferson has beliefs, Burr has none, and those weren't his exact words. Of course, those are the words used in the musical, and that swayed enough of the Federalists to side with him. But then there was still the problem that Burr got the second highest number of votes. And so he's supposed to be vice president. Well, Burr and Jefferson, by the time it got to this point, were not exactly on speaking terms, because Burr was one of the first candidates actually to campaign for office. And that bugged Jefferson. That was not a gentlemanly thing to do. And not long afterward, you had the passage of the 12th Amendment that specifies that the Electoral College will choose a president and a vice president separately.
Very good. We've got a little video issue going on, but I can still see you and everyone else can. So that's the
Yeah, who was that that came on?
Well, that was Jay Allred, our publisher, just kind of popping in to make sure. He wanted to pop in to make sure I was actually working today, so he popped in just to say hello.
He is. Carl's a hardworking guy.
All right, let's jump ahead a couple of decades. Now it's 1824, and the presidential race is between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, and the voters really didn't decide this one, did they?
Right. This was, it was not at all unusual in the early days for elections to be decided by the House of Representatives. This one in particular, the candidates were not just Jackson and John Quincy Adams. This was, by the way, the so-called era of good feelings. There weren't a whole lot of good feelings during the era of good feelings. People just call it that because the Federalist Party had basically died out in the late 1810s, and but the 1824 was the first election in which the Federalists, there were still a few hanging on, but they didn't even bother to nominate a candidate. So everybody knew the president was going to be a Democratic Republican, but immediately, sometimes you hear people say, well, you know what, the Republicans are going to take a shellacking in this election. The Republican Party may not even survive, and what we'll see is another era of good feelings. Well, yeah, but we're not going to have good feelings. For one thing, all those Trump voters are still going to be out there. And secondly, as soon as even assuming that the Republican Party goes away, there will be immediate infighting within the Democratic Party. And the example of the Democratic Republicans in 1824 is a classic example, because not only you have four perfectly viable candidates that are contending, and they're all Democratic Republicans. So you have John Quincy Adams. You've got Andrew Jackson, the backwoodsman from Tennessee. You've got William Crawford, who was from South Carolina. And then you've got Henry Clay of Kentucky. Henry Clay is probably the most famous politician in American history never to be president. But the four of them are all vying for office. None of them, when it comes to the Electoral College, none of them gets a majority. Although Jackson got the most votes, he got a plurality, and Adams came in second. But the rules say that if the election gets kicked to the House of Representatives, only the two highest vote getters can be considered at that point. So the question is, where are the Clay supporters and the Crawford supporters going to go? And there was a whole lot of maneuvering that went on. And what shocked Jackson was because how it gets decided if it goes to the House of Representatives was each state gets one vote, and the delegation within each state's congressional delegation, they decide how that vote is going to go. And when Jackson saw that certain states that had gone for him on election day now we're going for Adams, he thought something is really weird here. And then when he saw that after Adams was chosen as president, he named Henry Clay Secretary of State. Immediately, Jackson and his supporters started screaming, "Corrupt bargain!" That there was a deal here whereby Clay's supporters decided to throw their support to Adams, even though he was only the second highest vote getter, in exchange for a promise that Clay would become Secretary of State. By the way, back in this time, Secretary of State was understood to be like the next president. Today, it's like, well, vice president has a very good chance, maybe is often considered as a presidential candidate next time around. That was not the case. A lot of the vice presidents during this time were very forgettable, but secretaries of state went on. Madison and Monroe were examples of secretaries of state that went on to become president. So this was a big deal when Clay got the position. And as I say, Jackson and his supporters started screaming about a corrupt bargain. This is really the first campaign where I don't know that these words were used, but this was about draining the swamp. Right? Washington is corrupt. All of these Easterners here, even though Clay wasn't really an Easterner, but this backwoods Tennessee guy who was very popular and he was known as a tough guy. He's going to come in there and clean house and going to purge the corruption.
I think one of the things I read about, and this is kind of after the election, but Jackson's inauguration party may have been one of the most memorable inauguration balls of all time. One of the things I read is a statement by Margaret Smith, who was a Washington socialite, who said, "Ladies fainted, men were seen with bloody noses, and such a scene of confusion took place as is impossible to describe."
Yeah. Barrels of whiskey and hard cider. It was a drunken brawl, and sort of more refined Eastern politicians just shook their heads and said, the republic is done. The republic given to us by guys wearing tights and ruffled shirts is now giving way to this ruffian, this hooligan. So yeah, this really did mark a pretty important turning point in presidential history.
Yeah.
To an extent that we find difficult to believe today. People could come and see the president. Just knock on the door. Well, all right, come on in, and the president would often give time to him. And that was so. A lot of presidents did that. And second, so especially a guy like Jackson, who wanted to portray the idea that he was from the common clay. No pun intended. Also, most people would be shocked at how much liquor was consumed at this time in American history. It was shocking amounts were consumed for any occasion. Drinking was like the national pastime, and there was no event, which is why a temperance movement developed. The idea was, okay, this is getting out of hand. Dipsomania is running wild. That's, by the way, that was the term that was used for what we call alcoholism today. I kind of like dipsomania, though. It has a nice ring to it. I think we should go back. I say he was a dipsomaniac.
Sounds much more proper.
Yeah.
All right. Next up is 1860, the presidential election just before the Civil War broke out. Now, most people remember Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. I'm not sure as many recall John Breckinridge and John Bell, but tell us about the election that helped trigger a war.
Yeah, this one was crazy. For one thing, it's we often forget Lincoln did not have much of a political pedigree. He had served one term in Congress, or in the 1840s. He was best known for an unsuccessful run to the U.S. Senate from Illinois, which is where he faced off against Stephen Douglas in 1856. So he becomes the candidate because among the Republican Party, which, by the way, had not been around very long. I think 1860 was only the third time the Republicans ran a presidential candidate. He was regarded as a moderate within that party. On the one hand, you had some hardcore radical abolitionist types, and then you had others who really were. They were only all that opposed to slavery because it's a lot of people don't realize this today. There were a lot of Americans who who opposed slavery, but their opposition to slavery didn't come from some belief that in equality between whites and blacks. It was really motivated by, these were northern politicians who said, we don't want slavery here because we don't want black people here. So it was possible to be anti-slavery and very racist. And there was a wing of the Republican Party that believed this. Lincoln was somewhere between the two, right? On the one hand, he was genuinely opposed to slavery, but he was also prudent about it. And he believed we have to follow the Constitution. And he believed that the Constitution, like it or not, protects slavery in the states where it already exists. So Lincoln made a big deal of saying, all I'm interested in is keeping it from spreading to the territories. Now, he understood that eventually, if you keep it from spreading, if you keep slavery limited to where it is, eventually, as the country grows, as more states are added to the Union, the slave states will lose the kind of power they had over the national government, because they'd had, in much of the 19th century, a stranglehold over the national government. You did not have anti-slavery. There were certainly anti-slavery members of Congress, House and Senate, but you never had an anti-slavery president. And the Supreme Court was, generally extremely favorable to the slave interest. So Lincoln becomes the first viable candidate to go on record as saying slavery. Well, I guess from the very early days, but he goes on record as saying slavery is wrong, and it would be good if we could get rid of it. Although again and again he said, I'm not going to mess with it. If I'm elected, I'm not going to mess with it where it already exists. Well, the fact that he took that position not only meant that he was not going to be a viable candidate in the southern states, he wasn't even going to be on the ballot. Abraham Lincoln did not receive a single vote in any of the slave states. Now, the Democrats, there's Stephen Douglas, as you say, Carl. That's the name that people remember as his opponent, the senator from Illinois, the champion of the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty said, yeah, anybody can go into the territories, they can bring slaves if they want, and ultimately the people in the territories get to vote to see how whether the territory will enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. And that's really what the Lincoln-Douglas debates were about. Is that acceptable? Well, by 1860, Southern Democrats looked at him and said, that's not good enough. Popular sovereignty is not good enough. There was really a hardening of pro-slavery attitudes in the South that said, we have to have the right to take our slaves with us to any place in the Union where we want to go and still have slavery respected. And even Douglas was not willing to go that far. So what did the Democrats split that year? The Southern Democrats leave the convention and they nominate John C. Breckinridge. And then there's Bell. Bell was the Constitutional Unionist Party. It's one of these small parties that pop up every now and again. And his position was basically, let's just do whatever we can to get the slavery issue out of the way. Let's resolve these. Let's stop fighting over this and come together. Of course, that had limited appeal. So when Lincoln gets the nod and he wins in the Electoral College without getting any votes from a single slave state, that was the signal that, the Southern Democrats said, we're done. Breckinridge swept the South. Lincoln swept the North, but the North had more electoral votes. Slaveholders said, this is our days. The days of slavery are now numbered. Actually, the days of the South are numbered, because this shows that a president can be elected without the South having cast a single vote in it. We can now be disregarded on every major issue, whether it be the tariff or slavery or whatever. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the tariff caused the Civil War. Slavery was the big issue. But beyond that, Southerners said, we can now be overruled on anything. And that's what really sparked secession.
All right. Let me turn this back. Okay, I think I've got it back one. Hold on one moment. Very good. Now, just over a decade later, 1872, we had a presidential election first.
Yeah.
This campaign was interesting, or this election was interesting, not necessarily because it was a tight race. It was Ulysses Grant against Horace Greeley. But tell us what happened that did make this interesting.
Yeah, well, it's weird for a few reasons. For one thing, the Democrats never actually nominated him. Greeley, that is. Greeley was the candidate of this splinter group, the Liberal Republicans. So they split off from the Republicans. Horace Greeley was their candidate. And then the Democrats said, well, okay, we'll go with him. And Greeley was a well-known figure. We'll support him. And that's our only hope of beating Ulysses S. Grant, who, after all, his name had a lot of cachet as the successful general. So that's one thing. But the thing you're really getting at is Horace Greeley died after the election, but before the Electoral College could meet. Now, when you first approached me to do this session, there were some real questions about President Trump's health. It looks like he has gotten over COVID. Who knows what's really going on? But I don't think anybody is. I think it's pretty clear that the president will still be alive at Election Day. But people started asking me, not just you, is there a precedent for an election where a president dies close to Election Day? This is the closest thing to that happening to a president. It happened, as I said, after the election, and fortunately, Greeley. It was already clear that Greeley was going to lose, but Greeley died in was it December or something like that. Had he been the winner, that could have really prompted a constitutional crisis. But they just had the Electoral College met, and his electors cast ballots for him. But it didn't matter because everyone knew that Grant had won.
All right, let's move ahead to 1876.
Yeah,
we have an Ohioan, Rutherford B. Hayes, against Samuel Tilden. Now, this was a close election that gave rise to something called the Compromise of 1877. Now, what can you tell us about that election?
Yeah, well, of course, this happens against the backdrop of, as the 1872 one did as well, the backdrop of Reconstruction. And the southern states were now back in the Union. They were casting electoral votes, but neither candidate won. Oh, wait a minute, no. Did Tilden just get a plurality? Tilden certainly got more popular votes than Hayes did. And then when they sat down to the Electoral College, there ended up, well, Tilden might have won at the Electoral College had there not been 4 states where the electoral votes were in question. 3 of them were former states of the Confederacy: Louisiana, Florida, I think South Carolina was the 3rd. The 4th was Oregon. Oregon was a different case. It turned out that one of the electors was an elected official, and that was and that wasn't kosher. So that threw the whole Oregon slate of electors into question. Ultimately, when they got things sorted out, so basically those 3 southern states, sets of electors for both candidates showed up. Right? Say, wait a minute. So the question was the votes in those states were in doubt. So it got thrown to the House of Representatives, and the question was, how were those states going to go? And when you saw South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana go for a Republican, you knew something was up, because a Republican could not get elected dog catcher in those places, because the states of the former Confederacy, after they were allowed back in the Union and Reconstruction was winding down, there was no way they were going to elect a Republican. The party of Lincoln, come on. Well, it became clear that there was a quid pro quo, that Hayes had said, if elected, I will bring home federal troops. And he was as good as his word. Reconstruction officially ended. with the departure of those troops in 1877. Hayes, rather than Tilden, even though Tilden had a majority, it had at least a plurality. It may have even had a majority of the popular vote. I have to go back and look at my notes on that.
So when the troops were recalled, that basically set the stage for almost 100 years of Jim Crow laws and bad things in the South.
Yeah, oddly, not immediately. I mean, of course, there were bad things that were going on all along. You had the Klan rioting, and some. When the states were originally reconstructed, there were many African Americans, newly enfranchised African Americans who were in government. They tended to be those regimes tended to be eliminated earlier after voting restrictions were lifted for whites. But what you saw within a generation of the end of Reconstruction is Jim Crow. Basically, the argument being made in the South was, well, if we are to have good government, and by the way, this happens very much at the same time as the progressive era. You had all sorts of southern progressives who were all for Jim Crow. In fact, it was often progressives who were the biggest champion. They said, we deserve good government. Blacks are incapable. Maybe later, at some point they'll be capable of exercising that judgment. But until now, we cannot let our government be held hostage by people who are not fit to vote. So Jim Crow laws were very popular, and the national administration did nothing to stop them.
All right, let's move into the 20th century. The year is 1912, and we've got a angry Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party. Now, what do you find most interesting about that race?
This is one of my favorites. In fact, you mentioned the role-playing games I do. I've been developing a game based on the election of 1912. So the situation is William Howard Taft is the incumbent. He is not particularly popular. He wasn't a particularly charismatic guy to begin with. Probably the only reason he won in 1908 was that he had the full-throated support of the former president Theodore Roosevelt. But yeah, on his own, he upset a lot of people because he wasn't as progressive as certainly as Teddy Roosevelt expected him to be. But he's standing for election, and after a lot of going back and forth, early in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt decides that he is going to jump in and challenge him for the Republican nomination. And at this point, it's easy to forget that the way that candidates, that nominees are chosen, has changed a lot. In the early days of the Republic, it was actually congressional delegations, right? The Federalists in Congress, House and Senate, got together and decided who the Federalist nominee would be. The Democratic Republicans in the House and Senate. That changed around the time of Jackson, when the country became more democratic, and that changed in favor of caucuses and conventions around the country in the various states. And what that ended up being was party leaders getting together, because after all, those are the people who tended to show up at caucuses and conventions. They would get together and decide, all right, what nominee or what candidate are we going to choose to be the party's nominee? And then, of course, the National Convention is where the final decision was made for who the party's nominee would be. In 1912, that was starting to change. Some states had primaries. Most states did not. And generally speaking, in the states that had primaries, Teddy Roosevelt won. But in the states that had caucuses, where party leaders were making the decisions, the party was saying, no, we want to stick with Taft. So it went to the Republican National Convention in what was that? It was in Chicago that year, and there was a big fight. because a lot of states' votes were contested, especially southern states, right? There were Republican Party organizations in the southern states. They tended to be small. They were suspected of being corrupt. There were a lot of challenges. It was an extremely contentious convention, but the party leadership delivered the nomination to Taft. And Roosevelt went nuts. I mean, Roosevelt's position was in primary after primary, in which the actual rank and file of the Republican Party was able to choose, I won and not Taft. But because the leaders of the party, gathering in smoke-filled rooms, decided that Taft was their man, he's going to get the nomination. Well, he walked out, he and his supporters walked out of the convention, and his supporters convinced him to start a new party. The Progressive Party, or as it became known as the Bull Moose Party, because TR famously said, I feel fit as a bull moose. And then, of course, there were the Democrats. They had a contentious fight, too, and because nobody had a majority going into the convention. Champ Clark of Missouri seemed like the favorite. Woodrow Wilson was behind him. There were a few other candidates who seemed viable. However, Wilson ended up being the nominee, and the party stayed together. It was not a split. This made all the difference because everybody understood, even though there was a separate party called the Progressives, everyone understood that this was a splinter from the Republicans, and that there were essentially two Republican candidates that were going to split the Republican vote. Everyone knew that meant Wilson was going to win, and sure enough, he did. He actually didn't get a majority of the popular vote, mainly because there were three candidates, but he got a huge majority in the Electoral College.
Now, Roosevelt must have known that what he was doing was handing the election to Wilson. Do you think he knew that and just said his disdain for Taft was such that?
Yeah, this was the argument that Republican loyalists, including some of his best friends like Henry Cabot Lodge and Elihu Root, they said, look, do you know what you're doing? All you're doing is splitting the party. TR thought that what he could do, that he might be able to win over. His real hope was that the Democrats would nominate somebody who wasn't progressive. A Champ Clark, for instance, who was mildly progressive, but he was kind of dull, or some Southerner, right? Some conservative Southerner. Had that happened, Roosevelt hoped that he could peel away enough progressives from the Democratic Party. But as soon as Wilson got the nomination, Roosevelt kind of knew that that wasn't going to work, but at that point he was so invested he wasn't going to back down. That wasn't Roosevelt's style.
If you're leading something called the Bull Moose Party, it's hardly something you can step aside from. But,
it's really, as I said, I like working on this game on it. It's so fascinating for a lot of reasons. There was an assassination attempt against Roosevelt just a few weeks before the election. And even though he was bleeding from a bullet wound, he still gave his speech, a very long speech. There's just a lot of wild stuff that went on in this campaign.
All right. Well, let's jump ahead to 1948. World War II is ended. We have Democrat Harry Truman against Republican Thomas Dewey, and also a Dixiecrat nominee, Strom Thurmond.
Right.
Pollsters really got this one wrong, didn't they?
They did, because things did not look good at all for Truman. And part of it was just kind of imagine what it would be like to be around in the late 40s. Right? There was a good chance, at least for a lot of younger people, didn't even remember a time when there was a president whose initials were not FDR. FDR was in office from 1933 until April of 1945. His name and the presidency were synonymous. And of course, he was Mr. Charm, Mr. Fireside Chat. And then suddenly he dies, and poor Harry Truman, he served as a senator, and he had a distinguished record in the Senate, but as he only met with FDR on a handful of occasions, even though FDR ran in 1944 when he certainly should not have been. FDR was extremely ill. His doctor said, "Don't do it," but the American people did not know how sick the guy was. Not only did he run for a fourth term while sick, and probably knowing he would not survive the next 4 years, he did nothing to prepare Truman to take over for him. And that really is kind of unforgivable, as far, especially given the importance of the time, right? The end of the war, the growing tensions with the Soviet Union. Harry Truman, who has zero experience in foreign affairs, suddenly is plunked down in the middle of this massive poop show. And a lot of people just felt like, well, after all these years of 12 years of FDR, we have this guy. There was the Republicans had a slogan that "To err is Truman," and in 1946, the Republicans took both houses of Congress for the first time since the 1920s. They were in control of Congress, and they were looking toward 1948, and they say, "We got this in the bag." Right? Truman, for whatever virtues he had, he was not a charismatic guy. He was not a great speaker like FDR. He hadn't had a very good presidency up to that point, and it was made worse by the fact that he had opposition within his own party. On the one hand, to his left, he had his former Secretary of Commerce, Henry Wallace. Wallace had been FDR's vice president, and then heading into the 1944 campaign, conservative Democrats said, "You got to get rid of Wallace. The guy's a lunatic." And FDR listened to them and got rid of him and replaced him with Truman. As a consolation prize, Wallace was named Secretary of Commerce. And he broke with Truman in 1946 over foreign policy. He thought Truman was being too hawkish toward the Soviets. And so he decided to run in 1948 to challenge as a challenger from the left. It would be wrong to say that Wallace was a communist or a Soviet agent. However, a lot of highly placed people within his campaign were in fact communists and Soviet agents. I think Wallace was mostly naive. And then, as you mentioned, Strom Thurmond becomes the leader of the so-called Dixiecrats, who don't like one of the really admirable things Truman did during his first term is he started embracing civil rights. He probably took civil rights more seriously than any president since Lincoln, and integrated the armed forces. It started at least moving the conversation forward on a lot of the things that would characterize the civil rights era, and some Southern Democrats wouldn't forgive him for it, and so he had this challenge on the right wing of the Democratic Party. So it did not look good for Truman that year. In fact, even on election night, it was widely expected. This might be like 2016 was a comparable surprise. This was a Dewey defeats Truman situation. I say that because the Chicago Tribune, which was militantly Republican, didn't wait for the election results to be finalized before printing the headline for the next day, which said Dewey defeats Truman. And somebody, Truman's doing his victory lap the next day, and someone sticks in his hands a copy of that issue of the Chicago Tribune, and he holds it up, and the photographer takes the picture, and that becomes one of the most iconic press photographs of the 20th century. Why did he do it? I mean, he managed to hold the old New Deal coalition together. Thurmond and Wallace did not get significant support within the Democratic Party. He held on to union labor. He held on to farmers. He held on to small business people, and he certainly had the black vote. Right. So all of those things combined to give him and it wasn't even, it wasn't a landslide, but Truman won a convincing victory. Oh, it didn't help. I haven't even mentioned who his Republican opponent that year was. I'm blanking on his name. He ran against FDR in 44. He was the governor of New York. Thomas. I feel stupid. What's that?
Talking about Dewey?
Dewey. Thomas Dewey.
Yes.
Thank you. Dewey was not a very interesting candidate. I mean, he had a great record of public service as governor of New York. Before that, as district attorney, he was really effective against organized crime. And he was a handsome guy, but he wasn't charismatic. His strategy for 1948 was, I've got this in the bag, so I don't really have to come out and take strong opinions on anything. Somebody famously referred to him, it may have been Mencken, as the little man on the wedding cake. He kind of looked like that. Truman was very partisan in 1948. He hardly mentioned Dewey. He ran against against what he called the do nothing 80th good for nothing 80th Congress, which he called into special session in the summer of 1948, and put before them a whole lot of bills. He said, I want, increase in the minimum wage, expansion of Social Security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Congress refused to pass any of them, as Truman knew he would, and so he made that his campaign issue.
One of my favorite quotes, or that was attributed to Dewey during that election, was he said, "You know that your future is still ahead of you."
Yeah, right. Yeah. Somebody summarized his whole campaign rhetoric as the future lies ahead, the oceans are full of fish, and one other complete platitude.
All right. Now we're going to move to 1964. You had a tremendous contrast in candidates between Democrat Lyndon Johnson and Republican Barry Goldwater.
Yeah.
I know this campaign gave us a big contrast, and it also gave us one of the most controversial campaign ads ever made. What do you find most interesting here?
Yeah, first of all, that Goldwater was the candidate. He was very unlikely, and a number of historians have argued that he, in fact, really didn't want to win. It's certainly the way he behaved on the campaign trail suggests that he didn't do any of the things that you would like. If Dewey's strategy was to just be completely non-controversial in the belief that all he would do is alienate potential supporters. Goldwater's strategy was to say exactly what was on his mind at any given time. So he gets the nomination because the Republican Party, they're sick of nominating what the conservative wing called Me Too Republicans. 1940 was Wendell Willkie. 44 and 48, Thomas Dewey. Even 52, Eisenhower was not nearly as conservative as a lot of Republicans wanted. So the right wing of the party benefited from the fact that Nelson Rockefeller was the alternative. Rockefeller had some liabilities, including being divorced, and which was really a hard pill for a lot of Americans to swallow at that time. And being involved with a woman who wasn't clear, they weren't clear that she may have still been married. In any case, he had some liabilities. He was a classic liberal Democrat, and the conservative wing of the party said, no way. Goldwater was known as hardcore conservative. And he was a conservative's dream. He had written a book called Conscience of a Conservative that was very, very popular on the right in the early 60s. And so there were National Review had just gotten off the ground in the 1950s, and National Review was nuts for him. Because he was perceived as being so far outside of the political mainstream, all Johnson really had to do was appear like an elder statesman. He had started in 19. I mean, he had embarked on the Great Society, his anti-poverty laws, and a whole campaign of a whole bunch of legislation. But LBJ had also presided over one of the largest tax cuts in American history. This is something that's often forgotten. John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were big advocates of reducing taxes. So a lot of people saw, even a lot of people that you would think ordinarily might go Republican, sort of liked business people, liked LBJ. They also liked him because he seemed more stable, right? If you're in business, you want a certain level of stability and predictability, and that didn't look like Goldwater. Goldwater, who he would campaign in Florida and say that Social Security should be privatized. Whatever you think of that particular issue, that's not a winning issue in Florida, where a lot of the elderly were. He talked about giving generals battlefield control over tactical nuclear weapons. That's what, by the way, inspired the Daisy the Daisy Girl ad, very famous one. You can find it on YouTube.
Yep.
A little girl picking flowers and picking daisies, and then all of a sudden she looks up with fear in her eye. And there's a countdown going on in the background. And all of a sudden she looks up with a startled look in her eye, and you see a mushroom cloud. That ad only ran once, but it didn't have to run more than that. It got all the news stations picked it up, and it became part of the news broadcast, which made it free advertising for Johnson. One more Goldwater anecdote that I can't help sharing. He I don't know if you remember where this was he campaigned, but one of his supporters owned a soft drink company, and this company turned out a soda called Goldwater produced it for the campaign. And so he got off the plane at this. He's at this campaign appearance. Somebody sticks a can of Goldwater in his hand, and he takes a drink of it. And he holds it out with disgust and said, "Pardon my French, this stuff tastes like piss." So the guy didn't have a filter, but it was not a surprise to anyone when he not only lost in 1964 but lost big. But of course, in '72, it was a role reversal when the Democrats nominated George McGovern, who was sort of a left wing Goldwater, and he also lost in a landslide.
Exactly. All right. Now, the last race we're going to look at today was the year 2000. Republican George Bush, whose father had been president, and Democrat Al Gore, who served as vice president for 8 years under Bill Clinton. This one I kind of liked, because people are talking about this year's election not being decided on election night, nor was it decided on election night in 2000. What do you remember? What can you tell us about the 2000 election?
Yeah, of all the ones we talked about, this is the only one that I was alive for. I was in fact teaching at the University of Georgia for that. I remember that. I'll never forget that election night. You know what? Can I go back to 1912 for one? This is another thing important about 1912. When there, like I said a couple of weeks ago, there were real questions about whether the president might die. There's no precedent for a presidential candidate dying before election day or during the campaign. But there was a vice presidential candidate, Sonny Jim Sherman. James Sherman of New York was Taft's running mate in 1912. I'm not even sure why they nominated him, because everyone knew he had a heart condition and he couldn't campaign very much. But he got the nomination anyway. And a week before the election, he died. And you couldn't reprint ballots at that point. Everything was ready to go. So his electors, Republican electors, were instructed to cast their vice presidential ballot for Nicholas Murray Butler, who was president of Columbia University at the time. The good news was Taft only had 8 electoral votes anyway, so it really didn't affect the outcome of the race. Okay, 2000. Wow. So at the end of the night, nobody was clear how Florida was going to go. right? The rest of the country, everything was down the line, and it became clear that Florida was going to decide the election. This was back before the days of people talking about Florida man. I think now, if it came down to Florida, people would be saying, "Good Lord, Florida." I don't remember that being the case in 2000, but maybe people who knew Florida better had that concern. So it was close enough in Florida to trigger a recount. The question is how that, a quick recount still showed Bush in the lead over Al Gore, but by a much smaller margin. So then there's this huge back and forth over how do we do the counting? And the Republican position was that the Democrats just wanted to go into specific areas and count there. They wanted to do a recount in places that are calculated to where they think that Democrats will end up doing better with the recount, and where there are Democratic local election officials who would oversee it. The Republicans said, "Okay, we just want to put the brakes on this. We already have a count. We don't have to go over this." Also, absentee ballots kept flowing in, and the question is, at what point do we stop counting these? It's the middle of November, and there is still no winner that's been established. Neither side wants to concede. Although Gore early on did a concession, and then he took it back and said, "Wait a minute, we still don't know what's going on in Florida." And of course, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stopped the recount and declared Bush the winner. And I really remember that being a big deal in the spring and summer of 2001. When he was in office, there were a lot of Democrats who just said that this was a stolen election. You know what stopped it? 9/11. And it was almost like people forgot about the 2000 election after 2001. That's not to say that Bush became he was a popular president for a while until the Iraq War, I guess. But yeah, I dare say that there are a lot of people who maybe had forgotten that 2000 was really that contentious, and it dragged on and on.
Right. All right, more than 200 years of presidential politics, some of the wildest and strangest elections that the world has seen. Now, if you were a betting man, John, would you say this year's election between Trump and Biden will one day be added to this list? 50 years from now, will a historian be talking about the election of 2020?
I hope. Well, I'm sure they will. I mean, because what's really unprecedented, there has never been an election in the midst of a pandemic like the one we're seeing now. The closest thing to what's going on now is the influenza of 1919. That was already out of the way by the time the election of 1920 occurred. And that was a really scary, that was an extremely scary virus, much worse, I think, than COVID. But it didn't affect the election. So even if, and I'm hoping that there is a winner on election night, that it's clear that it's not close. Whichever candidate that you support, I think everyone can agree they hope it's by a decent margin, so it doesn't get contested. But even if it goes very smoothly on election night, this is still going to be remembered as a campaign at the time of pandemic with, it has to be said, an unusual Republican candidate. It's hard to find, and Andrew Jackson is probably the closest comparison we can make for the comparison as in terms of Trump's personality and the way he is governed.
Very good. Well, we are approaching the hour, so that's going to wrap us up for today. I want to thank our guest, Ashland University Professor John Moser, for sharing some wonderful bits of presidential history with us today. Oh, and I'll throw this in. It's a shameless plug for the Mansfield Playhouse. John and I will soon be on stage together for A Christmas Story, which is a holiday classic you won't want to miss. So John will get to tell us that it must be made in Italy because it's
Fragile.
fragile.
Italian.
Well, thank you again, John.
Okay.
Finally, friends, if you believe in the kind of journalism we do at Source Media, Richland Source, Ashland Source, Knox Pages, please do consider becoming a member. Our websites are free and they always will be, but it does cost money to produce this content. Keep in mind that every membership dollar goes toward funding our reporting efforts. Members get some awesome benefits in exchange for knowing they are keeping local, independent journalism alive and well in North Central Ohio. And by all means, folks, vote in this year's election. In-person early voting is underway. Absentee ballots are available. You can vote on Election Day itself in just about 3 weeks. Please, no matter who you support, local, national, state, be a part of the democracy. But for now, that's it from Source Media, John Moser, and IdeaWorks. Everybody have a great rest of the day and an even better week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.